The judicial dilemma. The current checks and balances system generates a prisoner's dilemma where the optimal strategy is the collaboration between the judiciary and legislature. Part 1. The status quo. The representative democratic political system basically consists of a separation of the three powers: legislative, executive, and judiciary. Ideally, the legislature is responsible for creating laws, the executive for enforcing laws, and the judiciary for interpreting laws. In praxis, however, all powers exercise both lawmaking and law enforcement. Legislative power emerges directly from the sovereign power of democracy, through the popular vote. Executive power can arise either directly or indirectly from the sovereign power, either through direct vote or through the vote of those elected by the population to the legislature, that is, the indirect vote, or even as a mixture of both forms. Commonly, the executive power is presented either in the direct form or in the mixed form. The judiciary, however, usually emerges indirectly in democracies, through the nomination or votes of those elected to the legislative or executive power, although it can also emerge directly from the democratic sovereign power. Part 1.1. Qui custodiet ipsos custodes, who judges the judge? To avoid abuses and errors, judicial systems are standardly hierarchically composed. The superior courts correct errors and abuses of the inferior courts. The endogenous hierarchical system invariably falls into Juvenal's classic dilemma: qui custodiet ipsos custodes? Any system will have a higher court, the problem being, who judges the Supreme Court? Through the judicial system itself, the judgment of the Supreme Court is not possible, since the judge who has the power to judge the judge of the Supreme Court himself becomes the new judge of the Supreme Court. The solution to this dilemma lies in the judgment of the Supreme Court judge from forces exogenous to the judiciary. A system of checks and balances where one of the three powers has the power to limit the other is usually put in place to curb abuses of power and other judicial misconducts. The most common practice in democracies is the indirect recall, that is, some directly elected power has the power to remove the Supreme Court judge from his position. Executive power is usually not used as a check on the judgment process of the Supreme Court judge when he makes his own selection. If the executive power selects the judge and also judges his removal, judicial independence from the executive power would be compromised. Therefore, the judiciary is usually limited by the legislative power, and, in bicameral systems, usually through the upper house. Part 2. Prisoner's dilemma formation. For the best functioning of a trial, there must be a judicial asymmetry between the defendant and the judge. If both can judge each other, that is, if there is a situation of judicial symmetry, the system constitutes a prisoner's dilemma. In a game where both financial profit and psychological profit and political profit had the same value, the matrix formed would be this. In this scenario, both cooperating and not cooperating would generate the same advantage, which is dangerous. In a game where financial profit and political profit had the same value while psychological profit was lower, this would be the matrix. In this situation, where financial profit and political profit are equally more valuable than psychological profit, the optimal strategy is cooperation between the legislature and the judiciary. In a game where financial profit was more valuable than political profit, which in turn was more valuable than psychological profit, in a 3:2:1 ratio, this would be the matrix of the game. In this scenario, the incentive for mutual cooperation between the judiciary and the legislature becomes even stronger. For a scenario where non-cooperation between the legislature and the judiciary be more advantageous, the psychological profit should be higher than the financial and political profit. Assuming a scenario of financial profit equals political profit equals 1, and psychological profit greater than 1, the matrix becomes non-cooperation between the legislature and the judiciary is the most desirable situation for maintaining the separation of powers, limiting abuse of power, and avoiding other forms of judicial misconduct. For the strategy of non-cooperation between the legislature and the judiciary to be the most advantageous among all strategies under the current indirect recall system, it would be necessary for the majority of members of parliament to value moral issues more than money and maintenance of power, but history shows us that this is a romantic, hopeful, and unrealistic view of systematic decision-making. For the judge of the Supreme Court to be properly judged, the executive power cannot be relied on, as it would destroy the independence of the judiciary cannot be relied on, as the judges of the Supreme Court suffer from judicial symmetry, with one cooperating with the other to avoid an unfavorable trial in the future, and the legislature cannot be relied on since, similarly to the judiciary, judicial symmetry between the legislature and the judiciary will encourage cooperation between the branches, enabling, for example, the leniency of judges of the Supreme Court in favor of political corruption of other branches in exchange for salary increases and other financial advantages approved by the legislature. In order for the judge of the Supreme Court to be judged, the judge of the Supreme Court must be subjected to judicial asymmetry, and only the democratic sovereign power can confer such asymmetry in a democracy. Part 3. Solution by election. The direct involvement of the people in the election of judges has two main forms. 1. Election by term of office. 2. Election by life tenure. With regard to corruption, there is empirical evidence about Supreme Court judges elected by term of office and less corruption, while appointed Supreme Court judges are associated with greater corruption. The reasoning is simple: the more the government is divided, the less it is prone to corruption. When the judiciary is elected and not appointed, it effectively participates as another division. Another no less important reason is that, although the judicial independence from the executive and the legislative powers is positive, the judicial independence from public opinion can be harmful. Examples of Supreme Court judge elections can be found primarily in the state and territorial courts of the United States. In the Texas Supreme Court, for example, elections are held for a term of 6 years. The term of office is associated with the lower judicial independence from the legislative and executive powers, and the lower judicial independence is, in turn, associated with lower property, political, and human rights rates and democracy performance, essential items for the development of a country. If the election is held for life tenure, the judge, after being elected, returns again to the problem of independence from public opinion and the judicial dilemma. The original dilemma is, therefore, again not resolved. Part 4. Solution by retention. If the solution to the judicial dilemma through election is not feasible or desirable, retention elections can be used as another means to break the judicial symmetry between the judiciary and the legislature that makes their cooperation the optimal strategy. Judicial retention elections take place in some U.S. states on varying dates and in Japan every 10 years. Basically, they work through the following question for the voter: should this judge remain in power? If the majority votes for yes, the judge remains in office. If the majority votes for no, the judge leaves office. The most common design is the so-called merit selection and retention elections, where the judge is appointed by the executive or legislature from a list made by the judiciary and faces the retention election at each determined length of time. The establishment of this design not only led to highly qualified judges compared to the common election model, but also made judges, due to popular approval, strive to not draw attention through leniency to crime, abuses of power, and other judicial misconducts. In almost all cases, judges are retained in office by a large margin. Judges are typically not held in office due to voters' approval of each individual judge, but due to voters' ignorance of negative events related to the judge, which incentives judges to exercise self-control to avoid their own abuse of power and other judicial misconduct, knowing that the judgment made by popular vote could remove them from office. This is how the solution to the judicial dilemma occurs through the retention election. Part 5. Solution by recall. The removal of the judge from the Supreme Court by direct recall is another solution for the participation of the sovereign power of democracy as a way of checking judicial misconduct, bypassing the dilemma of judicial symmetry between the legislature and the judiciary. The recall mechanism is based on the same principle as the retention election. The voter answers the following question: should the judge be removed from office? If the majority votes yes, the judge is deposed. If the majority votes no, the judge remains in office. However, the recall election is often more politically costly than the retention system. If, in the retention system, voting is done periodically and automatically, with every judge subjected to popular voting, the voting in the recall system must be triggered by a specific process, either for the entire Supreme Court or for a specific judge. This process can either be done by the legislature or executive, that is, through indirect recall, as it is currently done, without breaking the judicial symmetry between the judiciary and the other powers, or done by the people themselves, through the collection of signatures and voting, that is, through direct recall. However, as this system is made through processes that need to be actively triggered, its systematic use is limited by the high cost to trigger it. However, it should be noted that the recall system is not exclusive to the other listed systems and may be complementary. The end.